Hi everyone and welcome to today's session. So what we're going to be having a look at today is natural hazards and the risks that they pose. Now what I would like you to do please is this. Please can you turn your mobile phone off, shut your bedroom door, make sure it's nice and quiet so there's no distractions, and then let's crack on and have a really good session. Now what you're going to need just before we get started is a pen, a piece of paper, and literally nothing else. Right, I will see you in just a second. Okay, so the title for today's session is What are the factors which affect hazard risk? So what I would like you to do, please, is to write down that title. Now, it's a question, so make sure that you remember to pop a question mark on the end. Okay, right, let's make a start. So, what we are going to first look at is what is the definition of a hazard risk? So, hazard risk is the probability or chance that a natural hazard occurs. Now, probability is probably a word that you've heard in maths before, and it literally means what is the chance. Now, there are three main factors that affect hazard risk, and those three main factors are vulnerability, capacity to cope, and the nature of natural hazards. So what I would like you to do is to pause the video and just take a couple of notes on this, saying that hazard risk is the probability or the chance that a natural hazard would occur, and then those three factors: vulnerability, capacity to cope, and nature of natural hazards. And then in about 2 seconds time, once you've done that, I'm going to test your memory. So see if you can come up with a little cheeky way of remembering it. So VCN might be something to prod your mind. Okay, so what I would like you to do then is to pause the video to complete this task. And what I'm asking you to do is to define the term hazard risk, state the three factors that affect hazard risk. So I'm going to give you a little bit of help because this is only our second session, and give you some sentence starters. So hazard risk is, now don't forget that maths word that we used, and then the three factors that affect hazard risk are, and then maybe use the letters to prompt you, V, C, N. As soon as you've done that, come back to the video and we'll crack on. Okay, so did you get that hazard risk is the probability or the chance that a natural hazard occurs? And what I'd like you to do is actually to underline those key terms, probability or chance, up to you. And then those three factors, VCN, so vulnerability, capacity to cope, and then the nature of natural hazards. Give yourself a tick for each bit that you've got correct, because it's always nice to see your work covered in ticks. If you've got a red pen, you could even be the teacher today. Be amazing. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at each of these in turn and in a bit more detail. So the first one we're going to have a look at is vulnerability. Okay, so vulnerability. Now, this is a weird word to say. So first of all, say this after me, vulnerability. I'm imagining right now that I can hear you all saying it. So say it again, vulnerability. Good. Now, the reason it's a hard word is because actually it has that silent L. So that kind of makes it more difficult when we're trying to remember how to spell it. But you will have heard the word vulnerable before. And actually vulnerable normally means when you're at greater risk of something. And that actually helps us here when we're thinking about hazards. So the higher the population in an area that is exposed to natural hazards, the greater the probability that they will be affected by it. Now that makes perfect sense because essentially the more people there are in an area, the more likely they are to be affected by a hazard should it occur. So what I'd like you to do is to have a really good look at the photograph. Now this photograph shows the favelas in Brazil. Now favela is just another geographical word for a squatter settlement or a shanty town. But essentially, those favelas in Brazil, they are really, really densely populated, as in there are lots of people living in that area. So when Rio de Janeiro, which is the place in Brazil, is affected by flooding or by landslides, more people will be affected. Now, if you want to, pause the video and take some notes on that, because I'm going to ask you about it again in just a second. Okay, so we're going to take what we've just learned about Rio, and I would like you to have a look at this photograph. Now, this photograph shows the slums in Dharavi. Now, Dharavi is in the city of Mumbai, which is in India, and there are actually over 1 million people living in the Dharavi slums, and Dharavi is only 1 square mile big. So if you think about the size of your school playing field, that's about the same size as this place, Dharavi, and there are 1 million people living there. Now, I want you to think about what we've just talked about. So what would be one reason why this might be a particularly vulnerable area to natural hazards? But then I want you to look for another clue in the picture. What else might mean that more people in that area would be affected by a natural hazard if it was to happen? So pause the video now, have a good think. Okay. So what I was hoping that you were going to get from this was that one, Dharavi is densely populated. So it has a huge number of people living in a small area. So if a natural hazard is to occur, then actually more people would be affected. And the other thing that I was hoping you would see is that actually there is really low quality housing in this area. Now, Dharavi is a slum. So it's a bit like the favelas in Brazil, but it's a slum. And essentially, lots of the people there, they live in houses that they've built themselves, and they use materials that they can find. So you can see the corrugated iron and the bits of wood that are making people's roof. So let's say, for example, Dharavi was affected by an earthquake or a flood. These low quality houses would be more likely to be damaged, and then more people would be affected. Okay. So let's have a look at our next area, or our next factor that affects hazard risk, and that is capacity to cope. Now, capacity to cope essentially relates to a country's ability to be able to prepare for a natural hazard, because the more prepared you are, the lower the threat is. So take a good look at this photograph, and in this picture, what you're looking at is a sea wall and some rock armor in Japan. Now, the reason that the Japanese build sea walls and they build rock armor around their coastlines is because Japan sits on 3 tectonic plate boundaries. So they have a huge number of earthquakes that take place there. And those earthquakes often trigger tsunamis. Now, a tsunami is a big wave that's caused essentially when the 2 plates shift and the water is displaced. And what can happen is that coastal areas in Japan can then end up being flooded. So the Japanese, they've taken action and they've built this sea wall to protect their people. But the reason that Japan have been able to do that is because they are a high income country. They are one of the richest countries in the world. And as a result of it, they know that they're going to suffer from earthquakes, which may cause tsunamis. So they've invested in building these defenses. Right, if you want to, pause the video now and just make a note of that capacity to cope. Okay, so let's take what we've learned already about vulnerability and about capacity to cope, and let's have a look at these 2 images. So the first image shows Tokyo City. So Tokyo is the capital of Japan. So think about what I've already told you about Japan. And then let's have a look at the favelas in Brazil, which are in Rio de Janeiro. Now, to help you out here, Brazil is what we call a newly emerging economy. So it's not a high income country. It doesn't have as much money as that. So which one of these do you think would have a better capacity to cope? Okay, so I'm sort of hoping that all of you are saying A to the screen, because if you are saying the right thing. Because Tokyo has more money, it is able to therefore protect its people and has a higher capacity to cope than somewhere like Brazil and the favelas, where actually because they have less money, they have less of a capacity to cope. Now, that isn't to say that's true in every country, but it is the pattern, it's the norm. Okay, so the last one is the nature of natural hazards. Now, I've been a bit sneaky here because the nature of natural hazards is then actually broken down into 3 components. So whether a hazard can be predicted or not, the frequency with which it occurs, and then the magnitude of the hazard. So let me very quickly just explain a little bit about each of those. Now, the image that's on the screen is of Tropical Storm Talis, okay? And this is a hurricane. Now, a hurricane can be predicted. 4 or 5 days before a hurricane hits the land, this cloud pattern will form over an ocean, and we can see it on satellites. What that means is that then those scientists that analyze those satellite pictures can contact the areas that they think will be affected by the hurricane. And as a result of that, those communities can board up their windows, they can evacuate if they think it's going to be really serious, but it means they can take some action to be more prepared for when that hurricane strikes. Earthquakes are different. Earthquakes cannot be predicted. So an earthquake, we know where they might happen because they normally happen on tectonic plate margins, but there is no telling as to when that earthquake will happen. So as a result, people can't prepare in the same way that they would if it was a hurricane. Okay, the second thing is about frequency. So frequency means how often something happens. Now, like we talked about earlier, Japan sits on 3 tectonic plate boundaries. They are affected by earthquakes all the time. So in Japan, the people there, they know that they need to prepare for earthquakes by having earthquake drills in school, by, what else do they do? They have earthquake drills in school, they build their buildings to withstand earthquakes because they know that they are likely to be affected by them. However, when we then look at somewhere like Haiti, they had a huge earthquake back in 2010, but they hadn't had an earthquake for 100 years. So the people there didn't know what to do. They didn't know why the ground was shaking. They didn't know, and I'm going to save your life here maybe in future, they didn't know that if an earthquake happens, the 2 best places that you can be is under a table or in a doorway of a building. The doorway of a building is the strongest part of a building and the least likely to collapse. So it's really, really important that people know how often a hazard may occur, because then they can again be prepared. Now, the last thing is the magnitude of a hazard, and that essentially means the size. Now, you won't believe this, but we have at least 20,000 earthquakes that take place every single year, but only a few of them are major, because only a few of them have the magnitude to really affect people. So the size of a tropical storm, the size of an earthquake, the size of a volcanic eruption also matters. Now, if you haven't, while I've been talking, please pause the video now and take down those 3 points. Okay, so which of these hazards poses the greatest risk? Have a think. Good. Again, I can hear your brains working. The hazard that poses the greatest risk is B, the earthquake. And that's because you are absolutely right. We are able to predict hurricanes, but we're not able to predict earthquakes. Okay, so we are now on to the main task in today's session. And that main task is to explain the reasons why some hazards pose a greater risk than others, and to use the photograph in your answer. Now, I want you to imagine that this is a 4-mark question. And therefore, what I want you to do is to give 2 reasons as to why some areas are more at risk than others. So if we start by looking at our photograph and think back to what I said at the beginning of the session, one of the reasons why somewhere like a favela in Brazil might be more at risk of a hazard is because it is densely populated. So therefore, if the hazard takes place, more people are affected. So that might be your opening paragraph to this answer, or your opening sentences. What you then need to do is add a second reason. So another reason why some hazards pose a greater risk is, and then finish that sentence. Make sure, because this is an explain question, you've got a word in there that shows you are explaining. So it might be because, or this means, or as a result of, something like that. So pause the video now, answer your question, 2 points, make sure you refer to the photograph, use some connecting words, and I'll see you back here in just a second. Okay, let's run through our answer, and that is the last thing that we're going to do in today's lesson. So if you have a different colour pen, take it out now. If not, then you can underline key terms, whatever you prefer. So you can get 2 points, okay, for each explanation. So I've got my first one, which is, in the photograph, it shows a densely populated favela in Brazil. Now I've highlighted densely populated, and the reason I've done that is it's a key term. Normal people don't use the word densely populated, only geographers do. And it's really important that you sound like a geographer. Then I've gone on to say, this area is at a greater risk of natural hazards because, there's my explaining word, it has a high population, which means if a hazard occurs, more people are affected by it. That's my 2 marks. Then my second reason, another reason why some hazards pose a greater risk, is that some hazards can be predicted and others can't. For example, tropical storms can be seen on a satellite, so people can evacuate to safety. Therefore, less people are at risk of injury. And again, what you can see I've done is highlight those key terms within the answer. I've also got the word therefore, which I could have highlighted as my connecting word. Right, go through your answer, make any changes that you need to, copy some bits down of mine if you think you like my answer a little better than yours, that's fine. And then we're at the end of the lesson. Okay, you have done really, really well today, and I'm really impressed. Thank you for joining me. Now, there's just one last thing that I'm going to ask you to do, and it's quite important that you do this at the end of every lesson, really. I want you to go back through and to think about the 3 key things that you've learned this session. So for me, I would be thinking VCN. So vulnerability, capacity to cope, and the nature of natural hazards. Because if you can remember those, VCN, you are going to be onto a winner when you're trying to remember this in the future. Right, well done for today, and hopefully I'll see you for another session soon.